A man knocks on a door in the Hollywood Hills at 7:15 in the morning and tells the woman inside that she has 9 days. Not to move out, not to call anyone, not to make any decisions she might regret. 9 days to produce $31,000, or he will begin a process she does not want him to begin. He says it through a screen door, quietly, in the practiced tone of someone who has said versions of this sentence many times and has found that the quieter he says it, the more effectively it lands. Then he turns, walks down the front steps, gets into a black Tahoe idling at the curb, and leaves. The woman stands in her doorway for a long time after the Tahoe is gone. She is 63 years old. She has lived in this house for 31 years. The loan was supposed to solve a problem. It had become a different kind of problem entirely. Her neighbor's house is 40 feet away, up a slight incline, screened by a row of Italian cypress trees that have been there longer than either of them. She did not go to her neighbor. She did not think she could ask that. She did not know what was about to happen when her neighbor came to her. The street is called Torreyson Drive, and it runs along the western edge of the Hollywood Hills in Los Angeles, in a neighborhood that is quieter than it sounds. Not the canyon parties and the celebrity sightings of the more famous streets, but a residential stretch of modest lots and mixed-era houses where the same people have lived for decades and know each other well enough to wave and, sometimes well enough to talk. The house at the top of the incline belongs, in the informal grammar of the street, to the man who has lived there longest. He arrived 17 years ago, bought the property without fanfare, installed a modest garden along the south-facing wall, and became the kind of neighbor that other neighbors describe, when asked, as quiet and reliable, and occasionally, unexpectedly, there when something needed doing. The Italian cypresses along the property line were already there when he moved in. He never trimmed them back, because the woman downhill had told him once that she liked the way they looked in the morning light, and that had been sufficient reason. He drove a dark blue pickup truck. He was sometimes gone for months at a time, and when he came back the garden had suffered, and he would spend 2 or 3 mornings in succession setting it right before anything else. He had a way of appearing at the door on the particular days when something had gone wrong that was not, as far as any of his neighbors could tell, the result of surveillance. It seemed instead to be a form of attention that was simply always running, even when he appeared not to be paying any. The woman 40 feet downhill was named Loretta Vass. She was 63 years old. She had moved into the house on Torreyson Drive in 1993, 2 years after her husband died of a heart attack at 51. Because the house was smaller than where they had been, and the neighborhood felt manageable, and there was a small garden that needed tending, which she needed to need. She had worked for 28 years as a bookkeeper at a construction company in Burbank. She retired at 61. Her daughter lived in Portland and called every Sunday. Her granddaughter was 4 years old and called her Oma, and had been to Los Angeles twice, and had played in the garden with the particular focused interest of a 4-year-old who has discovered that dirt is interesting. The loan had started 2.5 years earlier. Her daughter had needed help, not a small amount. Her son-in-law had lost his business, a printing company in Portland that had been his father's, and that he had run for 6 years, and that had not survived a combination of bad contracts and worse timing. And the gap between what they had and what they owed was $31,000, and Loretta's savings were substantial, but not liquid, tied up in a CD that would not mature for another 14 months, and the interest penalty for early withdrawal was severe enough that her bank had suggested she look elsewhere for the short-term gap. She had found elsewhere through a man named Gerald Fitch, who was introduced to her by the bookkeeper at her former employer, who said he was a private lender, reliable and professional, who handled exactly this kind of short-term situation for exactly this kind of borrower. The rate was high. She knew it was high, but the term was 18 months, and she was confident she could repay the principal and the interest before the CD matured. Because she was a bookkeeper, and she had done the arithmetic 4 times, and it was workable. What she had not read carefully enough in the contract, and she had read the contract, which was something she would tell her daughter years later with a specific, exhausted self-recrimination, was the clause that allowed Gerald Fitch to restructure the repayment schedule at his discretion if the borrower missed a single payment by more than 7 days. She had missed one payment, 14 months in, by 11 days, because she had been in Portland with her daughter when her granddaughter had a fever that lasted 6 days, and she had lost track of the date, and Gerald Fitch had sent a letter to her house that she did not see until she returned. And by then, the 7-day window had closed. The new payment schedule added $14,000 to the balance and compressed the remaining term by 4 months. She had consulted 2 lawyers. Both had told her the clause was aggressive but not, on its face, unenforceable. One had said the words predatory lending, and then said that proving it in court would cost more than the loan. She had 3 payments left. They totaled $31,000. She did not have $31,000. Not liquid. Not in 9 days. Gerald Fitch was 51 years old. He kept an office on Ventura Boulevard in Sherman Oaks, in a suite on the 4th floor of a building that also housed an orthodontist, a tax attorney, and a small insurance agency. The suite had a reception desk that was usually occupied by a woman named Maria, who had worked for him for 9 years, and who answered the phone and scheduled meetings and processed paperwork with an efficiency that visitors sometimes mistook for warmth. He wore tailored shirts, open at the collar, and kept a pocket square that was never the same color twice. He drove a black Tahoe, always clean, never recently washed, as though cleanliness were a permanent condition rather than something that required maintenance. He wore a watch that had cost $8,400, which was not the most expensive watch available to him, and he had chosen it with the specific precision of a man who wanted people to register expense without being able to name the number. He had grown up in Canoga Park, 6 miles west of Sherman Oaks, in a house where money arrived and departed with an unpredictability that had left him. By the time he was 14, with 2 fixed beliefs, that financial precarity was a form of humiliation from which there was no recovery that wasn't, first, a kind of escape, and that the people who held money held power in a way that was simple and uncomplicated, and that he intended to understand from the inside rather than the outside. He had not started as a loan shark. The term was not one he used about himself, and it was not, technically, accurate. He was a licensed private lender in the state of California. His contracts were notarized. His rates were disclosed, as the law required, in writing. In the document each borrower signed. He did not send men with bad intentions to collect. He sent himself, or he sent a letter, or in cases where neither had achieved the desired result, he sent a colleague named Darren, who wore a black shirt and stood very still, and did not say much, and whose presence at a screen door at 7:15 in the morning was itself the communication. What Gerald Fitch had learned over 23 years of this business was that the most effective pressure was procedural, not threatening, not violent, administrative, a clause in a contract, a deadline with a specific day count, a restructured schedule that was, on paper, simply the terms the borrower had agreed to when they had not been careful enough. He had never been arrested. He had been the subject of 2 civil complaints, both settled, both sealed. He had 3 character witnesses on call, all of them respectable people who had borrowed money from him and paid it back and considered him a useful professional contact. He had also, which was the other thing he had learned, a quality of perfect confidence in his position that he had mistaken, for most of his adult life, for competence. He knew who lived at the top of the incline on Torreson Drive. He had known for 6 months. He had calculated that this knowledge changed nothing. He was wrong about that. It was the garden that brought it out. Loretta Vass had a rosemary hedge along the front of her property that she kept trimmed in April and again in September, and she was trimming it on the Saturday morning 3 days after Darren's visit when she dropped the clippers. Because her hands had not been steady for 3 days, and she had not been sleeping, and she sat down on the front step and put her face in her hands. She heard feet on the gravel before she heard the voice. "Loretta," she looked up. Her neighbor was standing at the edge of her front path in the dark jeans and gray sweatshirt he wore on the mornings when he was working in his garden, which was most mornings when he was home. He was holding her clippers. "I'm fine," she said. He handed her the clippers. He sat down on the step beside her, which was something they had not done before in 17 years. Not the sitting, which happened occasionally, but the particular proximity of it. The way he had placed himself close enough that she could have spoken quietly and been heard. He waited. She told him. Not everything. Not the name, not the 9 days, not the $31,000. She told him the shape of it. A loan, a missed payment, a clause she had not read carefully enough, a visit she had not expected, a number she could not produce. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What is the number?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Not in the way of a person calculating, in the way of a person thinking about something other than the arithmetic. "Can I make a phone call?" he said. "I don't want—" "I know," he said. "Let me make one call. You don't have to do anything." She looked at him. "Okay," she said. He stood up. He walked back to his house. She heard, distantly, nothing, because when he made the call he made it inside, and the cypresses absorbed whatever sound there was. The call was to a woman named Patricia Huang, who was a partner at a consumer protection law firm in downtown Los Angeles that had over 14 years been involved in 31 predatory lending cases in the state of California, 24 of which had resulted in judgments against the lender. He had her number because she had once been a guest at a fundraiser he had attended and had spoken briefly about the firm's work in a way that he had found worth remembering. He reached her on a Saturday, which said something about her, and he told her, in general terms, about the structure of the situation. He told her the name of the lender. There was a pause on the line. "Gerald Fitch," she said. "You know him." "We've been watching Gerald Fitch for 4 years," she said. "The borrower, she still has documentation? The original contract? The payment records? The letter?" He said he would find out. She said she would be available Monday morning, and that, if the documentation was what she suspected it was, the 9-day deadline was not going to hold up to a demand letter. She said the specific clause Loretta had described had been challenged in court 7 months earlier in a case with a different borrower and a different lender with an essentially identical contract. And the ruling had not gone in the lender's favor. "Tell her not to pay anything," Patricia Huang said. "And tell her not to speak to him or anyone representing him without counsel present." He thanked her and ended the call. He went back down the incline. He found Loretta where he had left her, on the front step, the clippers in her lap. He sat back down. He told her about Patricia Huang. He told her about the similar case, the ruling, the demand letter. He told her not to pay anything and not to speak to Gerald Fitch or Darren. She listened. When he finished, she said, "I can't ask you to." "You didn't ask," he said. "I offered." She was quiet. "I read enough contracts wrong in my life," he said, "to know that reading one wrong is not a character failing. "It is a Tuesday." She almost smiled. Not quite. "The clause," she said. "It was there. I saw it. I thought I understood what it meant." "You understood what it said," he said. "That's different from what it does. There are people who write contracts specifically for that gap." He looked at the rosemary hedge. "Patricia will send a letter Monday," he said. "You're going to want the original contract and anything else you have in a folder by Sunday night." She nodded. She looked at him for a moment. "Why the cypresses?" she said. "You could have cut them back years ago. You'd get more light on the south side." He looked at them. "You told me you liked how they looked in the morning," he said. She looked at the trees. 17 years ago," she said. "You said it once," he said. "That's enough." He stood up and went back up the incline. She sat on the step for a long time after that, not because she was afraid anymore, because something had shifted, and she needed to sit with it before she went inside. The demand letter arrived at Gerald Fitch's office by courier on Monday morning, which was 6 days before his deadline. He read it at his desk with a quality of attention he did not often give to correspondence, because demand letters usually represented the predictable first move of a borrower who had hired a lawyer and believed this would resolve something, and in Gerald Fitch's experience it rarely did. His contract held. It had held before. It would hold again. He read the letter twice. He called his own attorney, a man named Schaefer who had handled both civil complaints. Schaefer called back in 40 minutes. "The clause," Schaefer said, without preamble. "What about it?" "The clause is the problem. The clause has never been the problem." "It was the problem 7 months ago," Schaefer said, "in a case called Morano v. Pinnacle Lending, which is not our name on the document, but is our clause, almost word for word. And the court found it unconscionable under California Civil Code 16.7.5. A pause. Patricia Huang knows this because she argued Morano. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. "What does the exposure look like?" Gerald said. Schaefer told him. Gerald Fitch sat at his desk on Ventura Boulevard and looked at the watch that had cost $80,400 and thought about a number of things, most of which he had not thought about in a long time, and some of which he had been actively not thinking about for longer than that. He told Schaefer to set up a call with Huang's office. The call happened on Wednesday. Patricia Huang's position was direct. The restructured balance was unenforceable under Morano. The original loan balance was $31,000 and had been partially repaid over 14 months in the amount of $18,400, which meant the outstanding principal, not the restructured figure, the actual principal, was $12,600. Her client would pay $12,600 in full within 30 days. In exchange, Gerald Fitch would release the lien on the property, issue a full satisfaction of the debt, and agree to a formal settlement that included a clause prohibiting him from bringing any future action related to this loan or this borrower. Gerald Fitch accepted. He did not accept because he had been transformed. He did not accept because the conversation on the front step of the house on Torreson Drive had reached him in some way he was prepared to examine. He accepted because Schaefer had told him the exposure was real, and the clause was gone, and the math was simple. Some stories turn on a revelation. This one turned on arithmetic. The difference is that the arithmetic was made possible by the call on Saturday morning, which was made possible by the step beside a woman on a front step, which was made possible by a rosemary hedge and a dropped pair of clippers, and 17 years of a neighbor who paid attention. Loretta Vass paid $12,600 on the last day of the following month, drawn from the CD that she broke 11 months early. because the interest penalty on early withdrawal was $2,100, and $2,100 was a number she could manage and preferred to carrying the thing any longer. She sat at her kitchen table and wrote the check, a real check paper, because she had always paid bills by check, and put it in an envelope and sealed it and put it in her bag to mail the next morning. And then she sat there for a while with her hands around a mug of tea and looked at the garden she had tended for 31 years. She called her daughter that evening. She told her some of it. Not the knocking on the screen door, not the 9 days. The shape. That it had been resolved, that a neighbor had helped, that she was fine. Her daughter asked which neighbor. Loretta said the one with the garden up the incline. Her daughter asked if she should send a note. "I'll handle it," Loretta said. What she sent was not a note. It was a small clay pot, glazed in green, the kind that holds a single herb, with a sprig of rosemary from her own garden planted in the soil. She left it on his front step on a Thursday morning, when she could see, from the bottom of the incline, that the truck was in the driveway. She did not knock. She did not leave a card. He would know. Gerald Fitch's office on Ventura Boulevard closed 16 months after the settlement. The closure was not directly connected to Loretta Vass or Patricia Huang or the ruling in Morano v. Pinnacle Lending, though none of those things had helped. It was connected, more precisely, to a regulatory audit that the California Department of Financial Protection and Innovation had been conducting for 14 months, which had been initiated the previous October following a referral from a firm that had been watching his contracts for 4 years. Patricia Huang's firm was not the one that made the referral, but they had been in contact with the office that did. Maria, who had worked the reception desk for 9 years, was not involved in any of the subsequent proceedings and had not been aware of the audit. She found new employment within 3 weeks at a medical billing company in Encino, which her former colleagues in the building told her suited her efficiency better anyway. Darren, who wore the black shirt and stood still and did not say much, left the work entirely. He had been considering this for over a year. The 9-day visit on Torreson Drive was not the reason, but it was the thing that made the already forming decision feel complete. He took a job doing security at a hospital in the valley. The hours were regular. He was home by 7 most evenings. He called it, when his sister asked how the work was going, as the first job he had ever had where he went home lighter than he arrived. Loretta Vass still lives on Torreson Drive. The rosemary hedge is a little taller than it was, because she stopped trimming it quite as severely after the spring that is at the center of this story, not by plan, just by the slight loosening of a practice she had maintained too rigidly for too long. The garden is in good condition. The Italian cypresses are still there. Her neighbor's truck is still in the driveway some mornings and gone for weeks at a time on others. On the mornings when he is home and working in the garden, they sometimes wave. Occasionally, if the morning is right and neither of them has somewhere to be, they will stand at the edge of the property line and talk for a few minutes about the garden, or about whatever small thing has happened on the street, or about nothing in particular, which is the kind of conversation that requires a long history to sustain, and that sustains the history in return. Her granddaughter, who is now 7, came to Los Angeles last spring. She played in the garden as she had at 4, though with more interest now in which plants were which and why. On the second afternoon of the visit, she walked up the incline and rang the neighbor's bell and asked if she could see his garden. He showed her. She asked about each thing. He told her. She came back to Loretta's that evening with a sprig of lemon thyme in her hand that he had given her, carefully, to carry home. She asked if they could grow lemon thyme too. Loretta said yes. They planted it together the following morning, in the clay pot glazed in green. There is a version of this story where the important thing is Gerald Fitch and what happened to his office. I understand why that version is satisfying. It is satisfying to me too. The man who knocked on the screen door at 7:15 in the morning with a 9-day deadline should experience some consequence for that. And he did. And I am not going to pretend I do not find that satisfying. But the version I keep coming back to is earlier than that. It is a Saturday morning on a front step, and a woman has just told a partial truth to someone she has known for 17 years. The shape of the problem, not the full weight of it. Because she did not think she could ask for more than that. And the person beside her did not ask her to ask for more. He just picked up her clippers and sat down. I think about that distance. 40 feet between two front doors on a quiet street, and how rarely we cross it, even when we know something is wrong on the other side. Not because we don't care, because we are not sure we are the right person, because we do not want to intrude, because asking whether someone needs help requires us to be willing to hear the answer. He crossed the 40 feet. That is the whole story. Everything else followed from that. This story is fictional, inspired by Keanu Reeves' well-known reputation for the kind of neighborliness that asks nothing back and notices anyway. If something in this one stayed with you, drop a comment and tell me what you took from it. Share it with someone who might need it today. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. See you in the next one.